The blizzard descended upon the Carpathian Mountains with the fury of a vengeful god, turning the world into a howling void of white and ice. Mara pulled her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders as she trudged through snow that reached her knees, her leather satchel heavy with the winter herbs she had spent the day gathering from the frozen forest. At 26 years old, she had long grown accustomed to solitude, to the harsh whisper of wind through bare branches and the crunch of snow beneath her boots. The other villagers called her strange, the woman who lived alone in a cabin at the forest's edge, who spoke to plants and knew the old songs that could soothe fever and draw poison from wounds. They brought her remedies when sickness came, but kept their distance otherwise, as if her knowledge of healing carried some taint of witchcraft. The storm had come suddenly, as mountain storms often did, transforming a grey afternoon into a twilight of swirling snow and biting cold. Mara knew these mountains better than most, had walked their paths since childhood, when her grandmother first taught her which roots could cure and which could kill. But even her knowledge offered little comfort now, as visibility shrank to mere feet and the temperature plummeted with the dying light. She should have turned back an hour ago, should have sought shelter in one of the shepherd's huts that dotted the lower slopes. Pride and stubbornness had kept her moving, determined to reach home before nightfall. But now night was falling fast, and she could barely see the path ahead. Then she saw him, a dark shape against the white, collapsed in the snow like a fallen statue. Mara's heart stuttered in her chest as she rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the motionless figure. A man, dressed in fine black clothing now crusted with ice, lay face down in a drift. His raven hair was matted with snow, and frost clung to his pale skin like a death mask. For a terrible moment, she thought him already dead, but when she pressed trembling fingers to his throat, she felt a pulse, faint and irregular, beating beneath skin cold as marble. He had been poisoned. Mara recognized the signs immediately as she turned him over with effort, his body heavy and rigid with cold. His lips held a faint blue tinge, and when she pulled back his eyelid, his pupil was contracted to a pinpoint despite the darkness. Foam had dried at the corner of his mouth and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Someone had fed him monkshood, she was certain, or perhaps nightshade mixed with something else, something she would need to examine more closely to identify. But here in the storm, with darkness falling and the temperature still dropping, such knowledge meant nothing. They would both die if she did not move quickly. Mara looked around desperately but saw nothing through the whirling snow except the vague shadows of trees and the rising slope of the mountain. Her cabin lay 6 miles distant, perhaps more in these conditions, and the nearest village even farther. The man was tall, his frame broad beneath the expensive fabric of his coat easily twice her weight. Logic screamed that she should leave him, save herself, return with help in the morning if the storm cleared. But Mara had never been able to turn away from suffering, had pulled wounded animals from traps and nursed dying birds through winter nights. She could not leave this stranger to freeze alone in the dark, no matter how impossible the task ahead. She positioned herself beside him and worked her arms beneath his shoulders, bracing her legs in the deep snow. The first attempt to lift him failed completely, his dead weight too much for her slender frame. Mara gritted her teeth and tried again, this time using her legs to push upward as she pulled. Inch by agonizing inch, she managed to drag him into a sitting position, then maneuvered behind him to slide her arms under his from behind. With a desperate heave that sent white fire through her muscles, she hauled him onto her back, his arms draped over her shoulders, his head lolling against her neck. The world tilted dangerously, and Mara nearly fell under his weight, her knees buckling. She steadied herself with pure force of will, adjusting her grip, and took a single lurching step forward. Then another. The man's body pressed against her back like a corpse, cold and unresponsive, but his faint breath against her ear told her he still lived. That fragile thread of life was all that mattered now. She focused on it as she began the brutal journey home, each step a battle against exhaustion, cold, and the relentless weight bearing down on her spine. The storm intensified as if sensing her struggle, wind driving snow into her face until she could barely keep her eyes open. Mara moved by instinct and memory, following the slope of the land, the shapes of trees she had known since childhood. Her arms burned with strain, her fingers numb where they gripped the stranger's wrists. Twice she stumbled and nearly fell, barely catching herself before they both went down into the snow. If she fell, she knew she would lack the strength to rise again with him on her back. The thought of dying here, frozen together like tragic figures from an old ballad, flickered through her mind, and she pushed it away with grim determination. Time lost all meaning in the white chaos. There was only the next step, and the next, and the rhythm of her labored breathing mixing with the stranger's shallow gasps. Mara's legs trembled with exhaustion, her back screaming in protest, but she forced herself onward. She sang under her breath, one of her grandmother's old songs about a girl who carried the sun through the longest night, and the melody gave her something to focus on besides the pain. The man stirred occasionally against her back, mumbling words she could not understand in a voice deep and cultured, the accent of nobility unmistakable, even in delirium. Who was he, this fine lord who had somehow ended up dying in the mountains during a blizzard? His clothing spoke of wealth beyond anything she had ever known. Black velvet and silk beneath a wool coat lined with fur. Silver buttons gleamed dully even through the coating of ice, and when her numb fingers brushed his hand, she felt the smooth band of a ring, likely gold or platinum. No common traveler dressed so richly, and no common traveler would be alone in these mountains as winter's darkness fell. Questions flickered through her exhausted mind, but found no purchase. The only thing that mattered was reaching her cabin before they both perished. The wind shifted suddenly, and Mara caught a scent on the air that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Wood smoke. Faint but unmistakable, the smell of her own hearth carried on the storm wind. She had left the fire banked that morning, embers buried in ash to keep them alive through the day. If the wind brought their scent to her, she could not be far now. The knowledge gave her failing strength a final surge, and she pushed forward with renewed urgency, following her nose through the blinding white. Then, like a vision from a fever dream, the dark shape of her cabin emerged from the storm. Mara sobbed with relief, stumbling forward until her outstretched hand found the rough wood of her door. Getting it open while supporting the stranger's weight proved nearly impossible, but desperation granted her ingenuity. She braced him against the wall, holding him upright with her body as she lifted the latch and shoved the door inward. They fell across the threshold together in an ungainly heap, the blessed warmth of the cabin's lingering heat washing over them like salvation. Mara lay gasping on the floor for a long moment. The stranger sprawled half on top of her before she found the strength to move. She crawled out from under him and somehow managed to drag him away from the door so she could close it against the howling storm. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the wind battering the walls outside, she could hear both their harsh breathing and the rapid hammer of her own heart. Her entire body shook with exhaustion and cold, her muscles water, her hands so numb she could barely feel them. But there was no time to rest. The stranger's breathing had grown even more labored, his face corpse-pale in the dim light from the banked fire. Mara forced herself to her feet and stumbled to the hearth, adding kindling to the buried embers and blowing gently until flames caught and spread. The fire's light pushed back the darkness, revealing the full extent of the stranger's condition. Ice crusted his hair and clothing, his lips were blue, and beneath his closed lids she could see his eyes moving restlessly in fevered dreams or poison-induced hallucinations. With strength she did not know she still possessed, Mara dragged him closer to the fire, then set about stripping away his frozen outer garments. The coat came off with difficulty, heavy with ice and snow. Beneath it he wore a fine silk shirt and vest, both soaked through. She peeled these away as well, her healer's mind overriding any maidenly modesty as she assessed his condition. His torso was lean and muscular, the body of a man who knew swordplay or riding, but his skin held a pallor that went beyond cold, a marble whiteness that seemed almost unnatural in the firelight. The poison had been in his system for hours, she judged, perhaps since morning or even the night before. That he still lived at all spoke to a constitution of remarkable strength. Mara covered him with every blanket she owned, then turned to her herbs with desperate focus. Monkshood poisoning, if that was indeed what ailed him, required specific treatment. She needed to induce vomiting to clear any remaining poison from his stomach, then use activated charcoal to absorb what had entered his blood, foxglove tea in careful measure to support his failing heart, and willow bark to bring down the fever that was beginning to burn through him as his body fought the toxin. She worked through the night with single-minded intensity, forcing medicinal teas between his clenched teeth, monitoring his pulse and breathing, changing cold compresses on his forehead when fever spiked. He convulsed twice, his back arching as the poison racked his system, and each time Mara held him down and whispered the old healing songs her grandmother had taught her, the words in a language older than the village, older perhaps than the mountains themselves. Whether the songs held power or simply focused her own intent, she could not say, but his struggles eased each time as if he heard and drew comfort from the ancient melody. Sometime past midnight his fever broke and he fell into a deep sleep, his breathing finally steady and strong. Mara slumped against the wall beside him, too exhausted even to move to her own bed. She watched his face in the firelight, seeing it clearly for the first time now that the ice had melted and color had returned to his skin. He was beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel, his features sharp and aristocratic, his dark brows straight above eyes she had not yet seen open. His jaw was strong, his mouth full and sensual even in sleep, and there was something about the planes of his face that suggested both nobility and danger, like a wolf rendered in human form. "Who are you?" she wondered, studying this stranger she had carried 6 miles through a blizzard. "What brought you to the mountains alone, and who poisoned you?" The questions would wait for morning, for answers he would give when he woke. If he woke. The poison still coursed through him, and the next 3 days would tell whether her efforts had been enough. Mara's eyes drifted closed despite her attempts to stay vigilant, exhaustion finally claiming her. Her last conscious thought was a prayer to the old mountain spirits her grandmother had honored, asking them to preserve this life she had fought so hard to save. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the small cabin, warmth and firelight held back the darkness. 2 souls sheltered together, one a simple peasant woman who knew the healing arts, the other a stranger whose true nature remained hidden beneath aristocratic features and expensive silk. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and in those shadows something ancient stirred, drawn by the scent of blood and the pull of fate beginning to weave its threads. The night deepened toward dawn, and in that darkest hour before sunrise, the stranger's eyes moved beneath his closed lids, and his lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, as if in his fever dreams he heard a voice singing songs as old as darkness itself, and recognized in them something he had lost long ago. Mara woke to find the stranger's dark eyes watching her. She startled upright from where she had slumped against the wall, her neck stiff and her body aching from the previous day's ordeal. Pale morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. The stranger lay exactly as she had left him, wrapped in blankets near the hearth, but now consciousness had returned to animate those aristocratic features. His eyes were remarkable, she noticed, with a flutter of unease in her chest, pale grey like winter ice, and they studied her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through skin and bone, to examine the very essence of her soul. She moved quickly to check his pulse, her healer's instincts overriding the strange paralysis his gaze induced. His wrist was cool under her fingers, cooler than it should be, but his heartbeat was strong and steady. The fever had broken completely, and the blue tinge had left his lips, though his skin retained that unsettling marble pallor. When she leaned closer to examine his eyes for signs of remaining poison, he spoke for the first time, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "What is your name, woman?" The question held no gratitude, no weakness, only a commanding authority that made clear he was accustomed to immediate obedience. Mara sat back on her heels, meeting his gaze with the directness of someone who had lived alone too long to remember proper deference. "I am Mara," she said simply. "You were dying in the snow. I brought you here." The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed this information, his gaze traveling from her face to take in the humble cabin. the herbs hanging from the rafters, the simple furniture of a peasant dwelling. Something flickered across his features, an emotion she could not quite identify. Surprise, perhaps, or disbelief. "You carried me," he said, and it was not a question but a statement laden with implications she did not understand. "A woman alone carried me through the storm." 6 miles through the blizzard, Mara confirmed, moving to the hearth to build up the fire. "You were poisoned. Monk's hood, I believe, mixed with something else I have not yet identified. You should be dead." At this last statement she turned to look at him again, curiosity overcoming caution. "Who are you, my lord? And who would poison you and leave you to die in the mountains?" The stranger was silent for a long moment, those pale eyes never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice held a weight of centuries, though his face appeared to be that of a man in his prime, perhaps 35 years of age. "My name is Dracula," he said, and Mara's blood turned to ice in her veins. Count Dracula of Transylvania. The name hung in the air between them like a curse. Every child in the Carpathians knew that name, had heard the stories whispered by firelight on winter nights. The undead lord who dwelt in a castle high in the mountains, who commanded wolves and bats, who drank the blood of the living and could not be killed by mortal means. Mara had always dismissed such tales as superstition, the fears of ignorant villagers given shape and form. But now, looking into those ancient eyes in that too pale face, doubt crept into her certainty like frost across glass. "You do not believe in vampires," the Count said, and again it was not a question. He could read her skepticism as easily as she read symptoms of illness, and something like amusement touched his lips. "You are educated for a peasant, Mara. Your remedies are sophisticated, your knowledge extensive. You have saved my life with skills that would honor a physician in Vienna or Prague. Yet you do not believe in the supernatural, in creatures that walk in darkness and feed on the living. Tell me, how do you explain my survival? 6 miles through freezing cold, hours of exposure, enough poison in my blood to kill a dozen men. I should indeed be dead, as you so aptly noted." Mara's mind raced, seeking rational explanations, even as an instinctive dread began to coil in her stomach. "You are strong," she said, her voice steady despite her growing fear. "Some men have constitutions that can withstand what would kill others. The cold may have slowed the poison's progress through your system, giving me time to treat you. There are natural explanations for everything." The Count smiled then, and it transformed his face from beautiful to terrifying, revealing teeth that were perhaps slightly too sharp, too white, canines that seemed longer than they should be. "Natural explanations," he repeated softly. "Yes, you would cling to those. It is what makes you different, Mara, what made you risk your own life to save a stranger in the snow. Compassion and courage, qualities so rare in this world that their scent is sweeter than the finest wine." He sat up with fluid grace that belied his recent brush with death, the blankets falling away to reveal his bare torso. In the morning light, she could see his skin held no blemishes, no scars, smooth and perfect as alabaster. "When did you last see me breathe, healer?" The question struck her like a blow. Mara's eyes went to his chest, watching for the rise and fall that should accompany life, and saw only perfect stillness. No breath moved through him, no pulse beat visibly at his throat. Yet he sat there regarding her with amusement and something else, something hungry and dark that made her want to flee into the snow she had barely survived. "He is only holding his breath," her rational mind insisted desperately. "It is a trick to frighten me." But fear was already coursing through her veins, primitive and undeniable, the fear prey feels when it finally recognizes the predator. "The hunters who poisoned me knew what I am," Dracula continued, his voice almost conversational now, as if discussing the weather rather than revelations that shattered her understanding of the world. "They have pursued me for decades, those brave fools, armed with their holy water and wooden stakes and silver bullets. They nearly succeeded this time. The poison was monkshood mixed with blessed sacramental wine, a combination that weakens my kind considerably. Combined with the storm and the approaching dawn, I would have perished there in the snow, my body turning to dust as the sun rose. But you found me, Mara. You who do not believe in monsters, saved the very monster these mountains fear above all others." Mara backed away slowly, her hand reaching behind her for anything that might serve as a weapon. The Count made no move to follow, simply watched her with those terrible ancient eyes. "If you mean to kill me now," she said, proud that her voice did not shake, "then you are a poor guest indeed. I risked everything to save your life." The Count tilted his head, regarding her with an expression she could not decipher. "Kill you?" His voice held genuine surprise. "Oh no, my dear Mara, quite the opposite. You have given me something I have not possessed in centuries. You have given me hope." He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion that seemed to defy the laws of nature, no weakness in his stance despite everything his body had endured. Mara found herself transfixed, unable to look away as he moved closer with the grace of a hunting cat. When he stopped, barely an arm's length away, she could smell him, a scent of earth and stone and something else, something cold and old that made her think of crypts and midnight masses. "Do you know how long it has been since someone showed me genuine kindness? Since someone saw me suffering and offered aid without thought of reward or fear of consequence? You could have left me to die, Mara. You should have left me to die. The world would thank you for it. The church would name you a saint. But instead, you carried me through a blizzard that should have killed you both. And you spent the night fighting to preserve a life you did not know was already damned. What do you want from me?" Mara whispered, her back against the wall now, nowhere left to retreat. The Count reached out slowly, giving her time to flinch away, and when she did not, he touched her cheek with fingers cold as death. For a long moment he simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her heart ache despite her terror. Loneliness. Vast and terrible and eternal, the loneliness of an immortal creature who had watched centuries pass, and everyone he might have loved turn to dust. "I want to give you a gift," he said softly. "The gift of eternity, the gift of power beyond mortal understanding. I want to make you my bride, Mara, my companion through the endless dark. I want to transform you into something glorious and terrible, free from disease and age and death. You would stand beside me as countess, mistress of my castle, feared and revered by all who look upon you. Never again would you need to live alone in this hovel, gathering herbs and enduring the scorn of ignorant villagers. You would be immortal, powerful, magnificent." Mara stared at him, horror and fascination warring within her breast. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was madness, that vampires did not exist, that this was some elaborate trick or the delusion of a fever still gripping them both. But the part of her that remembered her grandmother's old songs, that had always sensed something older and darker moving through the forest at night, that part knew he spoke truth. And more terrifying still, a tiny, traitorous voice within her whispered that his offer held appeal: to never grow old, never sicken, never die. To possess power and knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, to never be alone again. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "I am no monster. I heal life, I do not feed upon it. I am a Christian woman, my Lord Count, and I will not damn my immortal soul for promises of earthly power." The Count's hand fell away from her face, and he stepped back, something like respect flickering in his gaze. "A Christian woman," he repeated. "Yes, I can see that now. The cross above your bed, the prayer book beside your hearth. You believe in heaven and hell, in salvation and damnation." He turned away from her, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered landscape. "And you believe I am damned beyond all hope of redemption, are you not?" Mara found courage returning now that he no longer touched her, now that space existed between them again. "The stories say you sold your soul to the devil, that you chose darkness over light, that you murder innocents and drink their blood. How can such a creature be anything but damned?" Dracula was silent for a long time, his back to her, his silhouette dark against the white landscape beyond the window. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of unimaginable sorrow. "I did not choose this existence, Mara. It was thrust upon me by forces I did not understand, in a moment of weakness and rage and despair. I was a warrior once, a defender of Christendom against the Turkish invasion. I fought with honor, with faith, believing God would reward my service. But God was silent when I needed him most. Silent when my wife threw herself from the castle walls, driven mad by lies told by my enemies. Silent when I fell in battle, my body broken, my prayers unanswered. And in that silence something else answered, something that offered me power to avenge myself against those who had wronged me, power to ensure I would never again be weak or helpless or at the mercy of mortal men. He turned back to face her, and in his eyes she saw the ghost of the man he had once been, the warrior prince who had defended his people and his faith. "I have done terrible things," he continued quietly. "I have killed, yes, and fed upon the blood of the living. I have embraced darkness and wielded it as a weapon against my enemies. But I remember what it was to be human, Mara. I remember love and hope and the warmth of the sun on my face. And last night, as you sang your healing songs over me, as your hands worked to save a life you did not know was already forfeit, I remembered something else. I remembered what compassion feels like, what selfless courage looks like when it lives in a human heart." Mara felt tears sting her eyes, though she did not understand why. The Count's words painted a picture of tragedy deeper than any tale she had heard. A fall from grace driven not by evil but by despair. She thought of her own loneliness, of the years lived in solitude, and tried to imagine that loneliness stretched across centuries. The attempt defeated her. No mortal mind could grasp such isolation. "I am sorry for your suffering, my lord," she said at last, "but that does not change what you are. It does not change what you have done. I cannot become what you are, no matter how prettily you speak of it." The Count nodded slowly, accepting her refusal with more grace than she had expected. "I will not force you, Mara. I am many things, but I have never taken a bride unwilling. But know this, I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. You saved my existence when you had every reason to let me perish. For that gift, I will protect you all the days of your natural life. No creature of darkness will harm you, no beast will threaten you, no illness will touch you while I have power to prevent it. Consider it my penance, if you will, the act of a monster trying to remember what it was to be a man." He moved to where his clothing lay drying by the fire, beginning to dress with efficient movements. Mara watched him, her mind churning with thoughts and fears and strange regrets. When he had finished and stood before her once more in his fine black garments, he looked every inch the aristocratic lord, powerful and remote. Only his eyes betrayed the ancient being beneath the gentleman's facade. "I will leave you now," he said formally. "Return to my castle and my cursed existence. But I will return, Mara. Again and again I will return, until you understand that what I offer is not damnation but liberation, until you see that darkness is not evil, merely the absence of light, and in that darkness wonders exist that daylight has never conceived. Then I will see you again, Count Dracula," Mara replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And each time I will tell you no. I choose the light, my lord, no matter how alluring you paint the darkness." The Count smiled, and this time the expression held genuine warmth, almost affection. "That is why I want you, my fierce little healer, that light within you, that unshakable faith. It calls to something in me I thought lost forever, until we meet again, Mara." He opened the door and stepped out into the snow. Mara followed, watching as he surveyed the white landscape with the eye of one who had known these mountains for centuries. Then, before her astonished eyes, his form seemed to blur and shift, his body dissolving into a swirl of mist that reformed into the shape of a great black wolf. The beast looked back at her once with eyes of pale grey, ancient and intelligent, before bounding away into the forest with impossible speed, leaving only tracks in the snow that would melt away before midday. Mara stood in her doorway for a long time after he vanished, staring at the place where he had disappeared. Her mind struggled to reconcile what she had witnessed with everything she thought she knew about the world. Vampires were real. Count Dracula existed, just as the stories said. And he wanted her, Mara, the lonely herbalist, to become his bride for all eternity. The thought should have filled her with revulsion, with holy terror. So why did her heart beat faster with something uncomfortably close to anticipation? Why did a part of her wonder what it would be like to accept his offer, to embrace the darkness and the power and the eternal companionship he promised? She closed the door firmly and returned to her hearth, trying to lose herself in familiar tasks, sorting herbs, preparing tinctures, mending the cloak torn by yesterday's ordeal. But her hands shook as she worked, and the cabin felt smaller than before, as if the walls had moved closer in the night. Everything had changed. The world had revealed itself to be far stranger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And somewhere in a castle high in the mountains, an immortal lord sat in his darkness and thought of her, the peasant woman who had carried him through a blizzard and refused to let him die. 3 days passed in uneasy normalcy. Mara went about her routines, gathering what herbs could be found in winter, treating the few villagers brave enough to seek her aid, praying longer than usual at night before sleep. She told no one about her strange visitor, knowing they would think her mad or worse, that they might come with torches and stakes to purge the woman who had sheltered a monster. But every night, as darkness fell, she caught herself watching the forest beyond her window, waiting for a shadow that did not come. On the 4th night, she woke to find him standing in her cabin, though she had barred the door and shuttered the windows. Dracula stood in the darkness near her bed, his pale eyes luminous like a cat's in the dim glow of the banked fire. Mara should have screamed, should have reached for the silver crucifix that hung above her headboard. Instead, she found herself sitting up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and asking the question that had haunted her for 3 days. "Why me, my lord? Of all the women in these mountains, all the noble ladies who would accept your offer gladly, why choose a poor peasant who lives alone and speaks to herbs?" Dracula moved closer, settling into the chair beside her bed with the grace of a predator at rest. "Because those noble ladies would accept for the wrong reasons," he said simply. "For power, for immortality, for escape from the boredom of their pampered lives. They would see only what they might gain, not what they would lose. But you, Mara, you understand the weight of the choice. You know what damnation means, what sacrifice is required, and you proved in the snow that you value life above your own safety, that compassion lives in your heart as truly as blood flows in your veins. Such qualities are rarer than gold, more precious than any jewel. I have searched for centuries for someone worthy to stand beside me in the darkness, and I found her carrying me through a blizzard, singing ancient songs and refusing to let death claim what she had chosen to save. His words moved through her like wind through trees, stirring things she had kept carefully buried. The loneliness she never spoke of, the hunger for connection that no amount of solitude could ease, the sense that she had been meant for something more than this half-life between village and forest, neither fully part of the human world nor entirely separate from it. "No," she said, but the word lacked conviction. "No, I will not become a monster. I will not damn my soul," but even as she spoke, doubt whispered in the darkness, and the Count heard it in her voice like a wolf hears the heartbeat of prey. "Time," he said softly, rising from the chair with fluid grace. "I have eternity, my dear Mara, and now, so do you, if you would but reach out and take it." He was gone before she could respond, vanishing as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving only the faint scent of earth and stone and ancient darkness. Mara lay awake until dawn, the crucifix clutched in her trembling hands, praying for strength she was no longer certain she possessed. Winter deepened its grip upon the Carpathian mountains as weeks passed, and with each nightfall, Dracula returned to Mara's cabin. Sometimes he appeared at her door like any mortal visitor, knocking with courtly politeness and waiting for her invitation to enter. Other times she would wake to find him already present, a dark figure standing by her window or seated by her fire, as if walls and locks meant nothing to his kind. She should have feared these nocturnal visits, should have fled to the village church and begged sanctuary behind walls blessed and consecrated. Instead, she found herself preparing tea before sunset, setting out 2 cups, knowing he would come as surely as night followed day. Their conversations ranged across centuries and continents. Dracula spoke of the world beyond these mountains, of great cities he had walked through in darkness, of empires that had risen and fallen during his immortal existence. He described the court of Constantinople before the Turkish conquest, the streets of Rome during the Renaissance, the salons of Paris where philosophy and revolution stirred in equal measure. Mara listened with hunger she had not known she possessed, her mind expanding to encompass histories and cultures she had only dimly imagined. In turn, she shared what she knew, the humble wisdom of herb lore and mountain legends, the observations of a healer who had spent her life studying the intricate mechanisms of life and death. He never touched her without permission, never moved too close or spoke words overtly seductive. Yet seduction wove through every conversation like a dark thread through pale cloth, not in what he said but in the very fact of his presence. Here was a being of immense power and knowledge who sought her company above all others, who listened to her words as if they held profound meaning, who looked at her not with the dismissive tolerance the villagers showed, but with genuine interest and something that might have been respect. Loneliness, Mara was discovering, could be a more potent poison than monkshood, working slowly through the heart until resistance crumbled like frost beneath spring sun. One night when snow fell thick outside and the wind howled like lost souls seeking shelter, Dracula arrived bearing gifts. He placed them on her rough wooden table with ceremony that would have suited a palace throne room. A book bound in aged leather, its pages covered in illuminated script and detailed drawings of herbs she had never seen. A bolt of deep crimson velvet, fabric finer than anything she had ever touched, a necklace of silver and dark garnets that caught the firelight and seemed to burn with inner fire. Mara stared at these offerings, torn between wonder and alarm. "I cannot accept such gifts, my lord," she said carefully. "They are far too valuable, too fine for a simple peasant. What would the villagers think if they saw me wearing garnets and velvet? They would call me witch in truth, or worse, your mistress." Dracula smiled, that dangerous, beautiful smile that made her heart skip despite her caution. "Let them think what they will. You deserve beauty, Mara. You deserve knowledge and comfort, and all the treasures the world can offer. These are but tokens, the smallest fraction of what I would give you, if you would accept my greater gift." Always it came back to this, his persistent offer of immortality and darkness. Mara turned away from the gifts, moving to the window to stare out at the falling snow. "Why do you persist, Count? I have told you again and again that I will not forsake my soul. I will not become what you are, no matter how you dress the offer in pretty words and prettier gifts. Why waste your time on a peasant woman too stubborn to see reason?" She heard him move behind her, silent as shadow, until he stood close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his body like winter itself given form. "Because you are the first person in 300 years to see me as something other than a monster," he said quietly. "The hunters see only evil to be destroyed. The nobles who know what I am grovel in fear or seek to bargain for their lives. The peasants cross themselves and flee. But you, Mara, you looked at me with compassion even after you knew the truth. You argued with me, challenged my words, treated me as if I were still a man capable of choice and change. Do you understand how precious that is? How rare to be seen, not as a creature of legend, but as a being who can still think and feel and perhaps even grow?" His words struck something deep within her, a chord of recognition that resonated with her own experience. Had she not spent years being seen as other, as strange, as useful only when someone needed healing? The villagers took her cures but never invited her to their celebrations. They sought her knowledge but shunned her company. She was the woman who lived alone, who was different, who did not quite fit the world she inhabited. In that moment she understood that loneliness could transcend the boundary between mortal and immortal. That isolation was isolation, whether measured in years or centuries. "I see you, Count Dracula," she said softly, still not turning to face him. "I see a being of immense power who is also profoundly alone. I see someone who remembers being human and mourns that loss even while embracing what replaced it. I see tragedy and darkness, and yes, evil too. For you have done evil things in your long existence. But I also see the possibility of something else, something better. You protected me these past weeks. No wolf has threatened my path. No illness has touched me. No bandits have approached my cabin, though they plague other isolated dwellings. You have kept your word. That speaks of honor, my lord, of a quality that evil itself cannot possess." She turned then to find him closer than expected, those pale grey eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "Do you begin to understand, then, that darkness is not the same as evil? That immortality need not mean damnation? I have done terrible things, yes, I have killed to survive and sometimes killed in rage or vengeance. But I have also protected these mountains from threats far worse than myself. I have prevented wars, stopped plagues, ended the reigns of tyrants who would have slaughtered thousands. The world is not simple, Mara. Light and dark, Good and evil. They are not opposing forces, but intertwined threads in a tapestry far more complex than your village priest can imagine. Mara shook her head, as struggling to hold on to certainties that felt increasingly fragile. The Church teaches that we must choose between God and Satan, between salvation and damnation. There is no middle ground, no grey area where one can serve both light and darkness. If I accept your gift, I forfeit heaven. I become one of the damned, cursed to walk the earth until some hunter plants a stake through my heart, or the sun burns me to ash. How can you ask me to choose that fate, no matter what compensations you offer? Dracula reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he took her hand in his. His fingers were cold, always cold, but his touch was gentle. The Church also teaches that God is infinite in mercy and compassion, he said, that no soul is beyond redemption if it truly seeks forgiveness. Do you believe that, Mara? Do you believe that even a monster such as I might find grace, might through centuries of struggle and growth become something worthy of salvation? Or do you think I am damned forever, beyond all hope, my fate sealed in that moment of despair when I accepted darkness? The question laid bare the central conflict, tearing at her soul. If she believed all vampires were irredeemably evil, then she must stop these visits, must flee to consecrated ground and never see him again. But if she believed even the damned might seek redemption, might slowly crawl back toward the light, then perhaps his courtship held meaning beyond temptation. Perhaps in showing him compassion, in treating him as a being still capable of growth and change, she served God's purpose more truly than she would by condemning him as monster. I do not know, she whispered. I want to believe in redemption for all souls, but I am not wise enough, not learned enough to understand such mysteries. I am only a healer who tends wounds and mixes herbs. These questions are too large for me, my lord. Dracula brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with old-fashioned courtly grace. Then let me ask a simpler question. Will you come with me tonight to my castle? Not to be transformed, not to accept my greater gift, but simply to see my home, to understand more fully the existence I am offering. Knowledge before choice, Mara. Is that not what a healer values? Understanding before decision? Terror and curiosity warred within her breast. To enter Castle Dracula, the very heart of darkness in these mountains, seemed madness beyond measure. Every story she had ever heard painted it as a place of horror, of prisoners drained of blood, of unholy rituals and damned souls. But beneath the fear ran a current of intense fascination. To see with her own eyes the world he inhabited, to walk halls that had stood for centuries, to perhaps understand him more fully through understanding his domain. The healer in her recognized this as diagnostic necessity. How could she judge his nature without knowing his natural habitat? I will come, she heard herself say, but I will carry my crucifix and my faith, my lord. If I see evil beyond bearing, if you attempt to force transformation upon me, I will fight you with every means I possess. Dracula smiled, releasing her hand and stepping back. I would expect nothing less. Come then, my brave little healer, let me show you wonders and horrors in equal measure, and you shall judge for yourself whether the darkness is as absolute as you have been taught. He moved to the door and opened it, revealing not the snow-covered forest she expected, but a swirling portal of mist and shadow that made her eyes ache to perceive. This was supernatural power manifest, the ability to bend space and distance to his will. Dracula extended his hand toward her, waiting for her to make the choice, to take that step from her humble mortal world into his realm of immortal darkness. Mara clutched her crucifix beneath her dress, whispered a prayer to the Virgin for protection, and placed her hand in his. The transition was instantaneous and disorienting. One moment she stood in her cabin with firelight warm against her back. The next she stood in a vast hall lit by hundreds of candles, their flames casting dancing shadows on stone walls, hung with ancient tapestries. The castle hall was magnificent and terrible in equal measure, beautiful in the way a winter storm is beautiful, deadly in the way a wolf's jaws are deadly. Carved columns rose to a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, and beneath her feet lay marble inlaid with patterns that might have been decorative or might have been occult symbols. The air smelled of stone and age and something else, something that made the primitive parts of her brain scream warnings of predators and blood. Welcome to Castle Dracula, the Count said, his voice echoing slightly in the enormous space. "My home for the past 3 centuries, and before that, the home of my mortal ancestors for 500 years. These walls have witnessed much, Mara. Glory and tragedy, love and betrayal, the full spectrum of human experience. And now they witness something new, something unprecedented. A mortal woman who comes here of her own will, seeking not treasure or power, but understanding." He led her through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced nobles, through chambers filled with books and scientific instruments, through a gallery displaying weapons from a dozen different eras and cultures. Mara saw no evidence of the horror she had expected, no chained prisoners or blood-stained altars. Instead, she saw a library that would rival any university, a laboratory equipped with alchemical apparatus both ancient and modern, quarters that spoke of scholarship and lonely contemplation rather than monstrous appetite. "You seem surprised," Dracula observed, as they entered a conservatory where exotic plants grew beneath glass panels that must have cost fortunes to install. "Did you expect to find torture chambers and coffins filled with grave dirt? I am a predator, Mara, but I am not a savage. I do not kill wantonly or torture for pleasure. I feed when necessary, taking only what I need and rarely enough to kill. I study, I learn, I attempt to impose order and meaning upon an existence that might otherwise descend into bestial madness. This is what immortality allows when one chooses to use it wisely, rather than surrendering to base instinct." Mara moved among the plants, recognizing some from her herb books, but seeing many she had never encountered. Dracula followed at a respectful distance, letting her explore at her own pace. She paused before a flowering plant with deep purple blooms, its leaves edged in silver, beauty and poison combined in one delicate form. "Aconitum paradoxicum," she breathed. "Impossible. This species only grows in the mountains of Nepal, and it cannot survive European winters. Yet here it thrives, kept alive by knowledge and resources beyond her imagining." "I have connections throughout the world," Dracula said quietly. "Scholars and botanists who send me specimens, sometimes knowing what I am, sometimes ignorant of everything save that I pay well for rare finds. I have spent decades cultivating this collection, healing herbs alongside deadly poisons, medicinal plants beside those used in ritual and sorcery. Knowledge, Mara. I offer you access to knowledge that no mortal healer could accumulate in 10 lifetimes. Think what you could learn, what cures you could discover, what suffering you could alleviate with centuries to study and resources unlimited by mortal poverty." The temptation coiled around her heart like serpent vines around a tree, squeezing until she could barely breathe. Everything he showed her, everything he offered, appealed to the deepest parts of her nature. The healer who wanted to save every life, the scholar who hungered for knowledge, the lonely woman who craved companionship and understanding. But underneath the appeal ran darker currents. What price would she pay for these marvels? What would she become if she accepted his gift? Would she still be Mara, or would the transformation burn away everything essential about her soul, leaving only a monster wearing her face? "Show me the rest," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "If I am to understand, I must see everything, not just the beautiful library and the magnificent conservatory. Show me where you sleep, my lord. Show me how you feed. Show me the truth of what you are, not merely the cultured facade." Dracula regarded her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering in his pale eyes. "Very well. You wish to see the monster beneath the gentleman? I will not shield you from the reality, Mara. Come." He led her deeper into the castle, down stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, into regions where candlelight barely penetrated the gloom. The temperature dropped with each descending level, until Mara's breath misted before her face, and cold seeped through her clothing to chill her bones. They passed through chambers carved from living rock, some empty save for shadows, others containing objects she glimpsed only briefly, but which sent instinctive revulsion shuddering through her. A table with leather restraints, chains bolted to walls, dark stains on stone floors that might have been rust but were almost certainly not. "This is the old section," Dracula said, his voice flat and emotionless now. "From the days when I was young in darkness, when I embraced cruelty as a weapon against those who had wronged me. I do not use these chambers anymore, have not for more than a century. But I keep them as reminder of what I was, what I could become again if I surrender to rage and hunger. I am not asking you to love what I have been, Mara, only to see that I am trying in my way to become something better. They descended further still until they reached a chamber that seemed carved from the mountain's heart itself. In its center stood an ornate sarcophagus of black stone, its surface carved with symbols that hurt to look upon, that seemed to writhe and shift in peripheral vision. "This is where I rest during daylight hours," Dracula said quietly. "Death's sleep, neither living nor dead, suspended between states while the sun holds dominion over the sky. It is closest I come to peace those hours of oblivion. Dreams do not reach me there, nor memories. Only silence and darkness and the slow, patient heartbeat of stone." Mara approached the sarcophagus cautiously, her healer's curiosity overcoming fear. She reached out to touch its surface and found it cold beyond mere temperature, cold as if it drew heat from anything living that came near. "Is it terrible?" she asked softly. "This existence you would share with me? Is it lonely beyond bearing? Does the night feel endless, and the years stretch out like some eternal punishment? Tell me true, my lord, not pretty lies designed to seduce me, but the reality of what I would face if I accepted your gift." Dracula moved to stand beside her, one hand resting on the sarcophagus as if drawing comfort from its familiar coldness. "It is terrible and wondrous both," he said at last. "Yes, it is lonely, unbearably so at times. I have watched everyone I cared for wither and die while I endure unchanged. I have outlived nations, seen empires crumble to dust, witnessed the works of mortal hands blown away like chaff. Nothing lasts save me and my kind, and there are precious few of us scattered across the world, most of them mad or bestial or so ancient they barely remember what humanity felt like." He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw the accumulated weight of centuries, the burden of immortal existence laid bare. "But it is also glorious, Mara, to witness the turning of ages, to see human knowledge grow and expand, to watch art and music and literature evolve across generations, to study mysteries with time unlimited, to pursue understanding without the pressure of mortal years counting down to death, and most precious of all, the possibility of finding someone, even once in several lifetimes, who might share the burden and the glory, someone who could walk beside me through the endless night and make the darkness a little less absolute." His words painted pictures in her mind, visions of herself transformed into something powerful and eternal, standing in this very chamber, centuries hence while the world above changed and changed again. She could almost feel it, the seductive pull of immortality, the promise of escape from the grinding poverty and limitation of mortal existence. But beneath the vision ran a current of loss, of everything she would sacrifice. Sunlight on her face, the simple joy of watching seasons change and knowing she changed with them, the hope of heaven and eternal rest after earthly struggle, her very humanity, that precious spark that made her who she was. "I need time," she whispered, stepping back from the sarcophagus and from him. "This is too much, too large a choice to make in a single night. You have shown me wonders and horrors as you promised, but I cannot decide now, cannot choose between everything I am and everything you offer. Give me time, my lord. Let me return to my cabin and think and pray and seek guidance." Dracula nodded slowly, acceptance and disappointment mingling in his expression. "I will give you time," he agreed, "as much as you need. But know that time itself may become your enemy, Mara. You are mortal. Each day you delay, you age another day, move another step closer to death. I can grant you centuries, but only if you choose before your mortal span expires." He raised his hand, and the mist swirled around them again, reality bending to his will. When it cleared, Mara stood once more in her cabin, the familiar firelight warm and welcoming after the castle's cold stone halls. She was alone, Dracula having departed as silently as he had appeared, leaving her to wrestle with temptation and faith and desire in the quiet hours before dawn. Mara sank into her chair by the fire, her mind churning with everything she had seen and heard. The choice before her loomed larger than any decision she had ever faced. Accept his gift and gain immortality, power, knowledge beyond measure, but lose her humanity and perhaps her soul. Refuse and remain herself, mortal and limited but pure, clinging to faith and the hope of heaven no matter how lonely the earthly road. Outside her window, the first faint grey of approaching dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Soon the sun would rise, and with it would come the simple necessities of mortal existence: food to prepare, herbs to gather, the daily round of tasks that defined human life. But everything had changed. She had walked in Castle Dracula and emerged unharmed. She had seen the monster's lair and found it less monstrous than expected, and somewhere in the darkness, an immortal lord waited with patience born of centuries, certain that time and loneliness would eventually erode her resistance, would bring her at last to accept what he offered. Mara clutched her crucifix and prayed, but for the first time in her life, she was not certain whether she prayed for strength to resist temptation or for guidance to know if accepting it might somehow serve a greater purpose. The line between salvation and damnation had never seemed less clear, and dawn brought no answers, only the pale, cold light of winter, and the knowledge that her choice, when it came, would echo through eternity. The weeks following Mara's visit to Castle Dracula brought a subtle shift in the rhythm of her existence. She went about her daily tasks with mechanical precision, gathering herbs, preparing remedies, treating the occasional villager who sought her aid. But her mind dwelt increasingly in shadows. The memory of those ancient halls haunted her waking hours, the vision of knowledge accumulated across centuries, the terrible beauty of the sarcophagus, where death and immortality met in uneasy union. She found herself standing at her window as darkness fell, watching the forest with anticipation she refused to name, and when Dracula did not appear for 3 nights running, disappointment gnawed at her heart like a patient disease. On the 4th night, violence arrived at her door. Mara woke to the sound of harsh voices and the smell of burning pitch. Through her window she saw torches, at least a dozen of them, held by men from the village whose faces she recognized. At their head stood Father Dominic, the priest whose sermons painted the world in stark divisions of divine and demonic, who saw Satan's hand in every misfortune and God's judgment in every tragedy. His voice carried through the winter air, righteous and condemning. "Come out, witch, come out and face the judgment of the faithful. You have consorted with darkness, sheltered the enemy of Christ, betrayed your immortal soul for unholy knowledge. The penalty is purification by fire." Terror seized Mara's heart as she understood the full horror of her situation. Someone had seen her with Dracula, or perhaps merely suspected, and that suspicion was enough for men already afraid of her difference, her solitude, her knowledge that seemed too extensive for a simple peasant. She was other, and in times of fear and superstition, other meant threat. The mob gathered outside her cabin carried rope alongside their torches, and she knew with sick certainty that they intended to drag her to the village square and burn her as witches had been burned for centuries, screaming their innocence while flames consumed flesh and bone. Mara grabbed her cloak and the small bag where she kept her most precious possessions, a few silver coins, her grandmother's ring, the prayer book that had guided her since childhood. The cabin had only one door and the mob blocked it, but there was a window at the back, small but large enough for her slender frame. She pushed it open and squeezed through, dropping into snow that cushioned her fall. Behind her she heard the splintering of wood as the mob broke down her door, heard Father Dominic's voice raised in prayer that sounded more like curse, calling down divine wrath upon the servant of Satan who had polluted their mountains with her presence. She ran into the forest, her bare feet finding purchase on frozen ground through sheer desperation. The mob's torches bobbed behind her like malevolent fireflies, their voices raised in hunting cries that spoke of ancient fears and older hatreds. Mara knew these woods better than any villager, had walked their paths since childhood, but terror made her clumsy, and the darkness was absolute beneath the forest canopy. Branches tore at her cloak and scratched her face, roots caught at her feet, and always behind her came the sound of pursuit, men driven by righteous fury, and the particular cruelty that emerges when fear transforms into action. A root caught her ankle and sent her sprawling into the snow. Mara struggled to rise, but her strength was failing, exhaustion and fear draining away the last reserves of endurance. The torches drew closer, close enough now that she could hear individual voices calling for her blood, promising that her death would purify the mountains of her taint. She clutched her crucifix and prayed, not for rescue, but for courage to face what was coming, for strength to maintain her faith, even as flames consumed her body. Then the wolves came, not one or two, but an entire pack, massive beasts with eyes that glowed red in the torchlight, their bodies larger than any natural wolf should be. They materialized from the darkness like living shadows, placing themselves between Mara and her pursuers, with teeth bared and hackles raised. The mob's forward momentum faltered, men stumbling backward as primal fear overrode religious fervor. Wolves were dangerous enough in normal circumstances, but these creatures radiated something beyond natural threat, something that whispered of supernatural power and ancient hunger. Father Dominic raised his crucifix and shouted words of exorcism, commanding the beasts to flee in God's name. But the wolves did not flee. They advanced slowly, their growls building to a chorus that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. One of the men, braver or more foolish than the rest, thrust his torch toward the nearest wolf. The beast moved with impossible speed, jaws closing on the torch and ripping it from the man's grasp, flinging it aside in a shower of sparks. The message was clear: leave now, or face consequences no mortal could survive. The mob broke. Despite Father Dominic's shouted commands, despite their righteous certainty moments before, the men turned and fled back toward the village, their torches bobbing wildly as they crashed through underbrush in desperate retreat. Only the priest remained, his face pale but set with stubborn faith. "You cannot hide behind demons forever, witch," he called out to Mara. "God's justice will find you, if not tonight then another night. You have damned yourself by accepting the devil's protection. Better you had burned and saved your soul than live under the shadow of Satan's wing." He turned then and followed his fleeing congregation, leaving Mara alone with the wolves in the dark forest. She should have felt relief at her rescue, gratitude for deliverance from horrible death. Instead, she felt a sick certainty that Father Dominic spoke truth, that in accepting Dracula's protection, even unwittingly, she had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. The wolves regarded her with intelligent eyes, no longer threatening now that the danger had passed, and in their gaze she recognized the same pale grey as Dracula's own. These were his servants, his eyes and teeth bound to his will and commanded to guard her life. The largest of the wolves, a massive black beast that stood nearly to her waist, padded forward and lowered its head, clearly expecting her to climb onto its back. Mara hesitated only a moment before accepting the implicit offer. Her feet were torn and bleeding from running barefoot through the forest, her body shaking with cold and shock. She had nowhere else to go. Her cabin would be ash by morning, everything she owned consumed by flames or stolen by the mob. The village was closed to her now, its people convinced of her guilt, their fear transformed into active hatred. She had only one refuge left, only one being in all the Carpathians who would shelter her without judgment or fear. The wolf carried her through the forest with supernatural speed, its packmates running alongside in perfect formation. Trees blurred past, and the wind of their passage brought tears to Mara's eyes. She clung to the beast's thick fur and tried not to think about what this rescue meant, what price would be expected for salvation from the mob's flames. When Castle Dracula rose before them, its towers black against the star-filled sky, Mara felt a complex tangle of emotions, fear and relief and resignation, all mixed together, until she could not separate one from another. The great doors opened as they approached, swinging wide on silent hinges to reveal Dracula standing in the entrance hall, still and watchful as a statue carved from alabaster. The wolves deposited Mara at his feet with surprising gentleness, then melted away into shadows, their task complete. She knelt there in her torn nightclothes, bleeding and exhausted and homeless, looking up at the immortal Lord who had promised to protect her and who had now made good on that promise in dramatic fashion. "They tried to burn you," Dracula said, and his voice was colder than she had ever heard it, cold as the depths of winter, cold as death itself. "Those ignorant fools dared to raise torches against you, to speak of judgment and purification, as if they possessed the authority to condemn. They will regret this night, Mara. I swear to you, they will know what it means to threaten what is under my protection." His eyes blazed with fury that made her shrink back. Despite knowing his anger was not directed at her, she had seen him courtly and cultured, had seen him melancholy and philosophical. But this was the first time she witnessed the predator fully unleashed, the monster that could slaughter armies and lay waste to kingdoms. "No," she said, forcing herself to stand, despite trembling legs, to meet his burning gaze with what courage remained. "No, my lord, you will not take vengeance on the village. They acted out of fear, misguided but understandable. Father Dominic convinced them I was a threat, that I had consorted with evil. They believe they acted righteously, in defense of their souls. You cannot punish ignorance with death." Dracula stared at her, as if she had spoken in an unknown language, his expression shifting from fury to disbelief, to something that might have been wonder. "They tried to murder you," he said slowly, as if explaining to a child. "They came to your home with fire and rope, intending to drag you screaming to a pyre and burn you alive while praying for your damnation. And you defend them? You ask me to show mercy to those who showed you none? What manner of woman are you, Mara? What strange courage or madness makes you plead for your enemies?" His voice had lost its cold edge now, replaced by genuine confusion, as if her compassion was incomprehensible to his ancient mind. "I am a healer," Mara said simply. "I cannot wish death upon any living soul, no matter what they intended for me. Yes, they were wrong. Yes, they nearly killed me. But they are also fathers and husbands and sons, men with families who love them, who would grieve if you destroyed them. Please, my lord, if you care for me at all, if my wishes hold any weight with you, promise me you will not harm them. Let this night's fear be punishment enough. Let them live with the knowledge that supernatural forces protect me, that their righteous mob was turned back by powers beyond their understanding. That will serve better than corpses to keep them away." Dracula moved closer, reaching out to touch her face where branches had scratched it, his cold fingers tracing the lines of blood with surprising tenderness. "You are either the wisest woman I have ever known or the greatest fool," he said quietly. "Perhaps both at once. Very well, Mara. For you and you alone I will spare them. But they have accomplished something tonight they did not intend. They have driven you from your home, burned your possessions, made you outcast and exile. You have nowhere else to go now, no shelter save what I offer, no protection save what I provide. Fate has made the choice for you, whether you willed it or not." His words struck her with the force of revelation. He was right. The mob had solved her dilemma in the cruelest possible way. She could not return to her cabin, could not resume her old life, as if this night had never happened. The villagers would hunt her if she tried to remain in the valley, and winter's grip was too fierce for survival in the wilderness alone. Her choices had narrowed to two stark alternatives: accept Dracula's hospitality and remain here in the castle, under his protection but also under his influence, or flee across the mountains and hope to find sanctuary in some distant town where no one knew her history. "I will stay," she said, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "For now I will accept your shelter and protection, but that does not mean I accept your greater offer, my lord. I remain mortal, Christian, human. I am grateful for your aid this night, but gratitude is not the same as surrender." Dracula smiled, and in that smile she saw satisfaction barely restrained, the triumph of a hunter who had maneuvered his prey exactly where he wanted it. "Of course," he said smoothly, "you are my guest, nothing more. I will provide you with chambers, clothing, access to my library and laboratories. You will want for nothing, and I will demand nothing save your company at dinner, and perhaps the pleasure of our evening conversations." He gestured toward the stairs leading to the upper floors. "Come, let me show you to your rooms. You need rest and healing, and tomorrow we can discuss the particulars of your situation." He led her through corridors she remembered from her previous visit, but this time, instead of showing her the grand public spaces, he brought her to a section of the castle clearly designed for habitation. He opened a heavy wooden door to reveal chambers that made her breath catch in wonder. A bedroom dominated by a canopied bed, hung with deep blue velvet. A sitting room with comfortable chairs arranged before a fireplace, already crackling with welcoming flames. A dressing room with wardrobes and a full-length mirror, and beyond it a bathing chamber with a copper tub that would have seemed obscene luxury in any normal circumstance. "These will be your quarters," Dracula said, moving through the rooms and lighting candles with casual gestures that suggested supernatural agency rather than mundane flame. "I had them prepared weeks ago, hoping you might eventually consent to visit for longer than a single evening. The wardrobes contain clothing in your size, everything a woman of culture and education might require. The books in the sitting room are selected for a healer's interests, treatises on medicine and herbalism from across Europe and beyond. You have complete freedom of the castle, save for the lower crypts where I rest during daylight. The servants will attend to your needs." "Servants?" Mara looked around nervously, seeing no one but sensing somehow that they were not alone. Dracula's smile held dark amusement. "My household staff are not what you might expect. Some are mortal, villagers from the valley who serve in exchange for gold and protection. Others are of my own kind, vampires who have sworn loyalty to me in exchange for sanctuary and feeding grounds. You need not fear them, Mara. They know you are under my personal protection, and none would dare threaten you. But I understand if their presence disturbs you. During daylight hours you may wander the castle freely and will encounter only the mortal servants." He moved toward the door, giving her space and privacy, but paused at the threshold to look back at her. "I know this is not how you wished things to unfold. You wanted time to choose, to make decision free from external pressure. The mob stole that luxury from you, and for that I am sorry. But perhaps fate is wiser than we are, Mara. Perhaps events have unfolded exactly as they needed to, bringing you at last to where you belong. Sleep now, heal, and in the coming days we will speak more of your future." He was gone before she could respond, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Mara alone in chambers more luxurious than anything she had experienced in her entire life. She sank into one of the chairs before the fire, her mind reeling from the rapid cascade of events. This morning she had been Mara the healer, living alone but free, following the path her grandmother had taught her. Tonight she was Mara the exile, sheltered in a vampire's castle, protected by supernatural forces and surrounded by dangers she could barely comprehend. She should pray, should seek guidance from God about her situation, but when she reached for her crucifix, her fingers found only torn fabric. The cross had been lost somewhere in the forest during her desperate flight, and its absence felt like an omen she dared not interpret too closely. Without its familiar weight against her chest, she felt unmoored, adrift between the mortal world she had left behind and the immortal one that beckoned with increasing insistence. Mara rose and moved to the window, looking out over the moonlit mountains that had been her home since birth. They looked different from this height, smaller somehow, the entire valley spread below like a painting, rather than the vast world she had always known. Somewhere down there her cabin burned, her possessions turned to ash, her old life ending in smoke and flame. Somewhere down there, Father Dominic prayed for her soul, while the villagers congratulated themselves on driving out evil, never understanding that their actions had pushed her closer to the very darkness they feared. A soft knock at the door startled her from dark contemplation. A young woman entered at her acknowledgement, mortal by the warmth of her cheeks and the steady rhythm of her breathing visible in the rise and fall of her chest. She curtsied deeply, her eyes downcast. "My lady, the Count has instructed me to attend you. I am Maria, and I will serve as your maid for as long as you reside in the castle. I have drawn a bath, and there is food waiting in your sitting room if you are hungry. Please let me help you with these torn garments." Mara allowed herself to be ministered to, too exhausted to protest the unfamiliar luxury. The bath was hot and scented with oils that soothed her scratched skin and aching muscles. The food, when she finally tried it, was simple but perfectly prepared, bread and cheese and soup that warmed her from within. Maria helped her into a nightgown of soft linen and brushed her hair with gentle efficiency, chattering nervously about the castle and its routines, clearly trying to put the strange new lady at ease. "How long have you served here?" Mara asked, studying the girl's face for signs of fear or coercion. Maria could not be more than 20, with dark eyes and a quick smile that suggested she was not unhappy in her position. The maid's expression grew thoughtful. "3 years now, my lady, since my parents died of fever and left me orphaned. The Count took me in when no one else would." gave me work and safety and better wages than I could earn anywhere in the valley. He is a strange master, I will not lie. There are nights when we hear things, when shadows move in ways shadows should not. But he treats his mortal servants well, never asks us to do anything we are unwilling to do, and protects us from the dangers that lurk in these mountains. And the other servants? Mara pressed gently. The ones who are not mortal? Maria's smile faltered slightly. We do not speak of them much, my lady. They keep to their own areas of the castle, hunt beyond our borders, and rarely interact with us save when the Count requires it. I have learned not to ask questions, to do my work and be grateful for employment that keeps me fed and sheltered. It is not a perfect life, but it is better than most orphaned peasant girls can hope for. The answer told Mara much about the complexity of Dracula's domain. He ruled here as feudal lord, providing for those under his protection while maintaining order through a mixture of genuine care and underlying threat. The mortal servants stayed because they had nowhere better to go, because the alternative was poverty and danger, because the devil they knew seemed preferable to the uncertainties beyond castle walls. Was she so different? Had she not made the same calculation when she chose to stay rather than flee into winter wilderness? Thank you, Maria, Mara said gently. You may go now. I need rest. And tomorrow we can speak more of how things work here. The maid curtsied again and departed, leaving Mara alone with her thoughts and the dying fire. She climbed into the enormous bed, sinking into softness she had never known existed, surrounded by luxury that should have felt like prison, but instead felt dangerously like home. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally claimed her, dreams waited in the darkness. She dreamed of walking through the castle's library, shelves stretching endlessly in all directions, each book containing knowledge she hungered to possess. She dreamed of standing in the conservatory among impossible flowers, their scents intoxicating, their beauty hypnotic, and she dreamed of Dracula watching her from shadows, his pale eyes luminous with patient desire, waiting for the moment when she would finally stop fighting fate and accept what he offered. When she woke to grey morning light filtering through heavy curtains, the dreams faded, but their emotional resonance remained. Mara lay still for long minutes, staring at the canopy above her head, and acknowledged a truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She was already half lost. The moment she had pulled Dracula from the snow and carried him through the blizzard, she had set her feet on a path that led inevitably to this castle. This choice, this slow dissolution of the boundaries between mortal and immortal, light and dark, salvation and damnation. The only question that remained was how long she would continue to resist what seemed increasingly inevitable, and whether her resistance served any purpose beyond postponing the surrender her heart had already begun to contemplate. Outside her window, the sun struggled to penetrate winter clouds, offering light without warmth, illumination without comfort. And somewhere far below in the crypts where daylight never reached, Dracula lay in death's sleep, dreaming perhaps of the night to come, and the conversations that would continue to erode her will, word by patient word, until the walls finally crumbled, and she stepped willingly into his embrace and the darkness beyond. 3 months passed in Castle Dracula, and with each sunset, Mara felt herself changing in ways both subtle and profound. She spent her days immersed in the Count's vast library, devouring treatises on medicine and herbalism that expanded her knowledge far beyond what her grandmother's teachings had provided. She experimented in the laboratory with compounds and preparations that would have seemed like sorcery to the villagers below. She walked the conservatory among impossible flowers and learned their properties from books written in languages she had to struggle to decipher. Knowledge accumulated like snow in winter, each flake individually small but together transforming the entire landscape of her understanding. The nights belonged to Dracula. He came to her chambers after sunset, always courteous, always respectful of boundaries she insisted upon maintaining. They dined together in a small salon, Mara eating mortal food while he sipped wine so dark it might have been blood, though she never asked and he never clarified. Their conversations ranged across philosophy and history, science and art, the accumulated wisdom of his centuries set against her mortal perspective and stubborn faith. He told her stories of empires and wars, of discoveries and catastrophes, painting pictures of a world far larger and more complex than she had imagined possible. But beneath the intellectual discourse ran currents of darker intimacy. The way his eyes followed her movements when she rose to examine a book, the careful distance he maintained, as if afraid that touching her would break some spell, the hunger in his voice when he spoke of eternity and what they might accomplish together given unlimited time. Mara was not naive. She understood that every conversation was seduction, every shared moment another thread in the web he wove around her heart. What disturbed her most was how little she wanted to resist. Maria attended her faithfully, helping her dress in the fine gowns that had appeared in the wardrobes, gowns of velvet and silk in deep jewel tones that transformed her from peasant healer into something resembling nobility. The maid taught her how to move in such garments, how to arrange her hair in styles befitting a lady of the castle, how to present herself as something more than what she had been. The transformation was external at first, but Mara felt it working inward, changing not just her appearance, but her very sense of self. When she caught glimpses of herself in mirrors, she sometimes failed to recognize the elegant woman staring back, her eyes holding knowledge and shadows that had not existed 3 months prior. She explored the castle during daylight hours, mapping its corridors and chambers, discovering libraries within libraries, laboratories hidden behind secret panels, chambers filled with treasures accumulated across centuries. The mortal servants she encountered treated her with deference bordering on reverence, as if her status as the Count's guest elevated her to position of power within the household hierarchy. At night she heard sounds from the lower levels, movements and voices that might have been human or might have been something else. She learned not to investigate too closely, to accept that the castle contained mysteries she was perhaps better off not understanding. Winter yielded slowly to early spring, and with the changing season came a restlessness Mara could not name. She found herself standing at windows watching the sun set with anticipation that felt dangerously close to hunger. The nights with Dracula had become the center around which her days revolved, and she caught herself counting hours until darkness fell, and he would arrive at her door with that slight smile and those ancient eyes. The realization that she was beginning to crave his presence, the way mortals crave food or water, sent alarm through her system. But the alarm grew fainter with each passing week. On a night when the first hints of green showed on the trees visible from her window, when the air carried scents of awakening earth rather than sterile snow, Dracula did not come to her chambers at the usual hour. Mara waited, telling herself she was merely curious about the break in routine, refusing to acknowledge the disappointment gnawing at her chest. When midnight passed and he still had not appeared, she made a decision that surprised her with its audacity. She would go to him, seek him out in whatever part of the castle he inhabited, and demand to know why he had abandoned their nightly ritual. She moved through darkened corridors with confidence born of 3 months' familiarity. Her feet, finding the path to the lower levels where she had been once before, on that first visit when he had shown her the truth of his existence. The crypts were as cold as she remembered, the air thick with the weight of stone and centuries. She found him in the chamber containing his sarcophagus, but he was not resting within it. Instead, he stood before it as she had stood before it months ago, one hand on its surface, his posture speaking of weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "You came," he said without turning, somehow sensing her presence. "I wondered if you would, if you had grown bold enough to seek me out rather than waiting for me to come to you." There was something different in his voice, a quality she had not heard before, resignation mixed with sorrow. Mara moved closer, concern overriding caution. "My lord, what troubles you? Why did you not come tonight as you always do? Are you unwell? Can vampires even become unwell?" Dracula turned to face her, and in the dim light she saw his expression held pain more profound than any physical ailment could cause. "I did not come because I realized something tonight, Mara, something that changes everything between us. I realized that I am in danger of committing a cruelty worse than any I have inflicted in 3 centuries of darkness. I am in danger of making you love me not through transformation, but through simple human emotion, and if you come to love me while still mortal, your choice will be tainted by feelings rather than made from rational assessment of what I offer." His words struck her like physical blows, forcing her to confront truths she had been carefully avoiding. Do you think I am so weak that I would surrender my soul for affection? That I would choose damnation because I have grown to enjoy our conversations? I am stronger than that, my lord. I have spent 3 months in your presence, in your castle, accepting your protection and your hospitality. If I were going to fall to temptation through mere proximity, it would have happened already. But it is happening, Dracula said softly, moving closer until only an arm's length separated them. I see it in your eyes when you look at me. I hear it in your voice when you speak my name. You are falling, Mara, as surely as snow falls from winter skies, and I am the ground that waits to catch you. 3 months ago you would have fled from this chamber in terror. Now you seek me out at midnight, concerned for my well-being, treating me as if I were a man rather than a monster. That is the most insidious form of seduction, the kind that works upon the heart rather than the flesh. Mara wanted to deny his words, to insist he was wrong, but honesty had always been her nature and she could not abandon it now. Perhaps you are right, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Perhaps I have grown to care for you in ways I did not intend, but that does not mean I will accept your gift. Affection and transformation are separate things, my lord. I can care for you and still choose to remain mortal. I can value our time together and still cling to my humanity and my faith. You taught me yourself that the world is more complex than simple divisions of light and dark. Why can you not accept that my feelings for you might be equally complex? Because I cannot bear to see you die, Dracula said, and the raw emotion in his voice made her breath catch. That is what I realized tonight, Mara, that I have made a terrible mistake. I thought I could court you patiently, could present my case with logic and evidence, could win you through intellectual argument. But somewhere in these 3 months I have done something I swore never to do again. I have allowed myself to care for a mortal being, knowing that mortality is another word for temporary. You will age, Mara. Already you are no longer as young as when I found you in the snow. Each day steals a little more of your vitality, moves you closer to the grave, and I will watch it happen. Will witness your decline, will be there when death finally claims you, unless you choose otherwise, unless you accept what I offer and step into eternity beside me. His confession laid bare the power dynamic she had been sensing, but not fully understanding. All this time she had thought herself the one in danger, the mortal at risk of losing her soul to supernatural seduction. But Dracula was equally vulnerable, perhaps more so, his immortal heart exposed to the inevitable grief that came from loving what could not last. The realization shifted something fundamental in her perception. He was not merely predator hunting prey. He was a being capable of love and loss, seeking companionship to ease loneliness that stretched across centuries, and finding himself trapped by the same human emotions he had thought transcended when he accepted darkness. "What would you have me do?" Mara asked, moving closer still, until she could have reached out and touched him if she dared. "Would you have me choose now, tonight, to ease your fear of future loss? Would you have me accept transformation to spare you the pain of watching me age and die? Is that what this conversation is truly about, my lord? Not my salvation or damnation, but your own inability to face grief again?" Dracula laughed, but the sound held no humor, only bitter recognition. "You see through me so clearly." "Yes, Mara, I am being selfish. I want you transformed not just for your sake but for mine. I want to preserve you exactly as you are now, intelligent and compassionate and fierce in your convictions. I want to freeze this moment in amber and carry it forward through centuries. I want to never lose you to time's inevitable theft. And yes, that desire is fundamentally selfish, fundamentally monstrous. But it is also profoundly human, is it not? To want to keep what we love, to rage against loss, to seek any means of preserving what matters most. His honesty deserved equal honesty in return. Mara reached out and took his cold hand in her warm one, feeling the absence of pulse, the stillness that spoke of death and suspension between states. "I do care for you," she said quietly. "These 3 months have taught me that monsters can be kind, that darkness can shelter rather than threaten, that evil is not absolute, but exists on a spectrum of choices and consequences. You have protected me, educated me, given me glimpses of wonders beyond mortal comprehension. And yes, I have come to value your presence, to anticipate our nightly conversations, to think of you as something more than the legendary terror parents use to frighten children." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "But I also care for my humanity, for the soul I believe exists within this mortal flesh. I care for the possibility of heaven, for redemption and grace and all the promises of my faith. And I care for the person I am, the healer who values life above all else. If I accept your gift, will I still be that person? Will I still care about easing suffering, or will I become something that feeds upon it? Will I retain my compassion, or will centuries erode it until I am merely another predator wearing human shape?" These are not simple questions with easy answers, and you ask me to make a choice that will determine not just my existence but my very essence. Dracula brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with the same courtly gesture he had used months ago in her cabin. "I cannot answer those questions for you. I can only tell you what I know from my own existence. Yes, you will change. Transformation alters not just the body but the mind, the very structure of consciousness. You will experience hunger you cannot now imagine, will struggle with urges that mortal understanding cannot encompass. But the core of who you are, that essence that makes you Mara rather than any other person, that can endure if you fight to preserve it. I remember being human. Remember the man I was before darkness claimed me. That memory has kept me from descending into complete monstrosity. Your compassion could serve the same purpose, could be the anchor that prevents you from losing yourself entirely to predatory instinct." His words painted the clearest picture yet of what transformation would entail. Not a simple exchange of mortality for immortality, but a constant struggle to maintain humanity while inhabiting inhuman flesh. Eternal life purchased at the cost of eternal vigilance, power balanced against the risk of corruption. Mara understood then that Dracula offered not paradise, but a different form of challenge, one that would test her in ways mortal existence never could. "I need to think," she said, withdrawing her hand from his with reluctance that surprised her. "I need time alone without your presence influencing my thoughts. Give me 3 days, my lord. 3 days of solitude to pray and contemplate and come to my decision. And whatever I choose, you must accept it as final. No more patient courtship, no more nightly conversations designed to erode my resistance. I will choose, and you will honor that choice, even if it means watching me grow old and die. Can you promise me that?" Dracula was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the crypt's shadows. Finally, he nodded slowly. 3 days. I will not come to your chambers, will not seek you out, will leave you to wrestle with your conscience and your desires in solitude. And yes, I will honor your choice, whatever it may be. But know this, Mara. If you choose mortality, if you choose to leave this castle and return to the world of daylight and human limitations, I will grieve for you every night for the rest of your natural life. And when death finally takes you, I will visit your grave and mourn what might have been for decades after your bones have turned to dust. The promise was both beautiful and terrible, a declaration of feeling more powerful than any romantic poetry. Mara fled before she could respond, hurrying back through the corridors to her chambers, her heart pounding and her mind in turmoil. 3 days to decide the course of eternity. 3 days to choose between everything she had been and everything she might become. She locked her door and fell to her knees before the fireplace, hands clasped in prayer that felt increasingly like conversation with silence. The first day she spent in frantic spiritual exercise, praying and reading scripture and trying to reconnect with the faith that had guided her since childhood. But the words seemed hollow now, promises of heavenly reward that paled against the immediate reality of earthly connection. She had spent 3 months in daily study of subjects that fascinated her, 3 months in nightly discourse with a being who treated her as intellectual equal. Could paradise offer more than that? Would heaven's eternal peace compensate for the loss of growth and discovery and challenge? The second day she spent examining her feelings with clinical precision, trying to separate genuine affection from seduction's effects. Did she care for Dracula himself, or merely for the attention he showed her, the escape from loneliness he provided? Was her growing attraction to darkness true desire or manufactured need, carefully cultivated through months of calculated exposure? She wrote lists of reasons to accept and reasons to refuse, trying to impose logic on decisions of the heart. But love, she was discovering, obeyed no rational framework. The third day she spent in the conservatory among the impossible flowers, surrounded by beauty that could not exist in the natural world, beauty preserved and protected by supernatural power. She thought of her grandmother, the healer who had taught her the old songs and the properties of herbs. What would that wise woman say about the choice before her? Would she counsel faith and refusal, or would she recognize in Dracula's offer a different kind of healing, the cure for loneliness and limitation that had constrained their family for generations? As sunset approached on the third day, Mara made her decision, not through prayer or logic or emotional assessment, but through simple, honest acknowledgement of what her heart already knew. She loved him. Not the monster or the legend or the supernatural power, but the lonely, immortal being who remembered what humanity felt like and struggled to maintain connection with it across the centuries. She loved his patient courtship, his intellectual depth, his surprising capacity for restraint and honor. She loved the way he listened to her words as if they mattered, the way he showed her wonders without demanding worship, the way he offered transformation as gift rather than imposing it by force. And if she loved him, truly loved him, then leaving would be a different kind of death. She would return to the mortal world and live out her remaining years haunted by what she had rejected, growing old while he remained eternally young, dying eventually while he continued endlessly. The thought of him visiting her grave, mourning alone in darkness while centuries unwound without her, was more unbearable than any fear of damnation. Mara returned to her chambers and dressed with care, choosing a gown of deep midnight blue that Maria had laid out weeks ago and she had never worn, too fine for casual wear, clearly intended for special occasion. She arranged her hair simply but elegantly and placed the garnet necklace Dracula had given her months ago around her throat. Then she descended to the crypts as darkness fell, her steps steady, her heart certain despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. She found him in the same chamber, standing before his sarcophagus as if he had not moved in 3 days. Perhaps he had not. Perhaps he had stood there in patient vigil, waiting for her decision, prepared to honor it whatever grief it might bring him. When she entered, he turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral, guarding against hope that might be disappointed. "I have made my choice," Mara said, her voice steady and clear. "I choose you, my lord. I choose transformation and eternity. I choose to walk beside you through the endless dark and face whatever consequences may come. Not because you have seduced me or broken my will, but because I love you, because I cannot bear the thought of leaving you to face centuries alone, because I believe that compassion can survive even death, and that perhaps together we might become something better than either of us could be alone." She saw the impact of her words in his eyes, the way his careful control shattered to reveal joy and relief and desperate gratitude. "Are you certain?" he asked, moving toward her but not yet touching, giving her space for final reconsideration. "This choice cannot be undone, Mara. Once transformation begins, there is no return to mortal existence. You will be what I am, cursed to shun daylight, to feed on blood, to watch the centuries pass while everything you knew crumbles to dust. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" "I am certain," Mara said, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "I am terrified, yes. I mourn what I am about to lose, but I cannot walk away from you now. Whatever I become, whatever struggles await me, I want to face them at your side. Transform me, my lord. Make me your bride in darkness as you promised so many months ago. Let us begin this journey together and see where eternity leads us." Dracula pulled her into his arms with fierce intensity, holding her as if she might vanish like morning mist if he loosened his grip. "You will not regret this," he whispered against her hair. "I swear to you, Mara, I will spend centuries ensuring you do not regret choosing me. I will teach you everything I know. I will protect you as you learn to navigate immortal existence. I will be your companion and guide through the darkness, and together we will find meaning in eternity that I could never find alone." He drew back slightly, his hands framing her face, his eyes searching hers one final time for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Mara met his gaze steadily, letting him see the resolve and love and acceptance she felt. She was ready. Whatever came next, whatever pain or transformation or struggle lay ahead, she would face it willingly for the sake of the being who had seen her not as peasant or healer or witch, but as Mara, valuable in herself, worthy of his courtship and his patience and his eternal devotion. "How does it happen?" she asked, keeping her voice calm though her heart raced. "What must we do to begin my transformation?" Dracula guided her to sit on the edge of the sarcophagus, its cold stone familiar now beneath her hands. "I will drink from you," he explained quietly, his thumb tracing the pulse point at her throat. "Not enough to kill, but enough to weaken you, to bring you to the edge of death. Then you will drink from me, taking my blood into your body, letting it work through your system and rewrite what you are. The process is painful, I will not lie. Your body will fight the transformation even as your will accepts it. You will feel yourself dying as mortality gives way to what comes after. But I will be with you through every moment, and when you wake, you will wake to eternity." Mara nodded, accepting the reality of pain as she accepted all other consequences. "I am ready," she said simply. "Begin." Dracula leaned close, his lips brushing her throat, and she felt his fangs pierce her skin with surprising gentleness. The pain was sharp but brief, replaced almost immediately by a floating sensation, as if she were being lifted away from her body. She felt her blood flowing out, felt her strength draining, felt the boundaries of consciousness beginning to blur. But through it all she felt his arms around her, solid and certain, anchoring her to reality, even as reality transformed around her. When he withdrew his fangs and bit into his own wrist, pressing the wound to her lips, she drank without hesitation. His blood was cold and tasted of earth and iron, and something else, something ancient and powerful that burned as it entered her system. Fire spread through her veins, consuming mortal flesh and remaking it into something new. The pain Dracula had warned her of arrived like a tidal wave, overwhelming sensation and thought and self. She felt herself dying, felt her human life releasing its grip, felt everything she had been burning away in supernatural flame. But through the pain she felt his presence, felt him holding her, heard his voice speaking words in languages she did not know but somehow understood. Ancient phrases of transformation and binding, spells or prayers or simple promises that helped her hold on to the essential core of who she was, even as everything else changed. The pain reached a crescendo that should have destroyed consciousness entirely, and then suddenly broke, shattered like glass struck by stone, leaving behind something new. Mara opened her eyes, and the world had transformed. Colors were more vivid, sounds more distinct, sense more complex than she had known possible. She could hear Dracula's heart, or whatever passed for a heart in their kind, beating slow and patient in his chest. She could smell the earth beneath the castle foundations, the stone of the walls, the distant blood of living things far above in the mortal world, and she could feel power, raw, supernatural force flowing through her transformed body, strength and speed and senses beyond human limitation. "How do you feel?" Dracula asked, helping her to stand. Watching her face with concern and hope mingled in equal measure, Mara considered the question carefully, taking inventory of her new existence. She felt different, profoundly changed, but not destroyed. Her memories remained intact, her sense of self preserved, her compassion and intelligence and essential nature somehow surviving the transformation that had burned away her mortality. "I feel like myself," she said wonderingly, "but also like something more, as if I have been living my entire life in a dim room and someone has finally opened the windows to let in light." She paused, then laughed at her own metaphor. "Except we cannot bear light anymore, can we? We are creatures of darkness now." Dracula smiled, relief evident in his expression. "You are still you. That is what matters most. The rest, the hunger and the limitations and the adjustments to immortal existence, we will face together. You are no longer alone, Mara, and neither am I." He pulled her close again, and this time when he kissed her, it was not the cold kiss of death, but the passionate embrace of two immortal beings beginning their eternal journey together. Mara returned the kiss with feelings she had suppressed for months, letting herself finally acknowledge and express the love that had grown despite her resistance, despite her faith, despite every rational objection her mind had raised. When they finally drew apart, dawn was approaching, the first faint lightening of the eastern sky visible even from the depths of the crypt. Dracula gestured toward the sarcophagus. "We must rest now. The sun's rise will bring death's sleep, and your first experience of it is best shared. Lie with me, beloved. Let us sleep as the dead sleep and wake together when darkness returns." Mara climbed into the sarcophagus without fear, settling against its cold interior as Dracula joined her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against his chest, and she felt a peace she had never known in mortal life. As death's sleep claimed them both, Mara's last conscious thought was not of regret or fear, but of gratitude. She had chosen love over fear, connection over solitude, the difficult path of transformation over the easier path of stagnation. She had saved Dracula from the snow months ago, but in doing so, she had also saved herself from a different kind of death, the slow erosion of spirit that came from living without purpose or passion or deep connection to another being. Whatever challenges awaited them in the centuries ahead, whatever struggles with hunger or morality or the slow drift away from humanity that time might bring, they would face together. She was no longer Mara, the lonely peasant healer. She was Mara, Countess of Darkness, bride of the immortal lord of these mountains, and her story was just beginning. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The village below forgot the woman who had once lived at the forest's edge, forgot the night they had driven her away with torches and righteousness. But in Castle Dracula, two immortal beings continued their endless conversation, their eternal companionship, their patient exploration of what it meant to preserve humanity while inhabiting inhuman flesh. They were not good in any simple sense, could not be while they fed on blood and shunned the light. But they were not purely evil either, not mindless monsters or servants of darkness absolute. They protected the mountains from threats worse than themselves. They studied and learned and grew across the centuries. They maintained that spark of compassion that had first drawn them together, using their power to ease suffering when they could, to prevent wars and plagues and injustices that their immortal perspective allowed them to recognize and address. They were predators, yes, but predators with conscience, with memory of humanity, with love that transcended the boundaries between life and death. And on winter nights when snow fell thick across the Carpathian peaks, when travelers lost their way in the darkness, sometimes they would find a castle appearing as if from nowhere, its gates open in welcome. They would be given shelter and food and aid without price or threat, and in the morning they would wake in some village below, remembering only fragments of dreams about a dark lord and his beautiful bride, immortal beings who had learned that even monsters could choose kindness, that even the damned could seek redemption, one compassionate act at a time. The story of the peasant woman who carried a poisoned count through a blizzard became legend, then myth, then fairy tale told to children on cold nights. But like all the best tales, it held truth at its core. Sometimes love requires us to carry another's burden even when it threatens to break us. Sometimes salvation comes not from choosing between light and darkness, but from finding the courage to walk the shadowed path between them. And sometimes the greatest act of faith is not clinging to what we believe, but opening ourselves to transformation that might reveal a more complex truth. In Castle Dracula, in chambers lined with books and filled with impossible flowers, Mara and Dracula continued their eternal dance, bound together by choice and love, and the memory of a winter night when compassion proved stronger than fear, when a simple act of kindness changed the course of immortal destiny. They were damned, perhaps, by the standards of the church and the judgments of the mortal world, but they were also alive in ways that mortal existence had never allowed, and their love endured across centuries that would have reduced mortal passion to dust. Whether that counted as happy ending or tragic conclusion, neither could say. They knew only that they had chosen each other, had fought to preserve what mattered most through transformation and time, and that whatever eternity brought, they would face it together as they had always intended, The darkness was their domain now, but it was a darkness illuminated by love, by purpose, by the stubborn insistence that even monsters could grow and change, and perhaps, in some distant future, find grace. And that, in the end, was enough.